Haile Selassie's historic warning to the League of Nations. The aging emperor stood alone before the League of Nations in Geneva, his dignified traditional robes a stark contrast to the European suits that filled the chamber. It was June 1936, and Haile Selassie Permun, the last emperor of a 3,000-year-old dynasty, had come to deliver a warning that would haunt the world. While Mussolini's planes rained mustard gas on Ethiopian villages and his tanks rolled through ancient kingdoms, the League's delegates sat in uncomfortable silence as Selassie prophesied their own doom. It is us today. It will be you tomorrow. This is the story of how an African monarch, dismissed by Mussolini as the chief of a barbarian nation, orchestrated one of history's most remarkable comebacks. From commanding troops on horseback against Italian bombers to running a resistance movement from an English villa, Haile Selassie would transform from a defeated exile into the first African leader to humiliate European fascism. His triumph would inspire a generation of anti-colonial movements and forever shatter the myth of European invincibility. But first, he would have to lose everything he had spent his life building. The early life of Tafari, Makonnen, a path to modernization. The scent of fresh roasted Ethiopian coffee wafted through the stone corridors of Harar's ancient walled city as young Tafari Makonnen made his way to his morning studies. Born to privilege but far from the direct line of succession, the slight, thoughtful boy spent his early years absorbing everything from church manuscripts to reports of the modern world beyond Ethiopia's mountains. In the labyrinthine politics of Africa's oldest independent nation, knowledge would prove his greatest weapon. Ethiopia in 1892 was a realm caught between millennia of tradition and the rushing tide of the 20th century. While steam engines transformed Europe and America, Ethiopian nobles still rode to war on horseback, their warriors carrying the same curved swords their ancestors had wielded against Muslim invaders centuries before. But young Tafari saw something his elders missed. The world was changing, and Ethiopia would have to change with it, or perish. By 16, Tafari had already begun to outmaneuver rivals twice his age. When Emperor Menelik II fell ill, the palace buzzed with plots and counterplots. While others reached for swords, Tafari built alliances. He cultivated relationships with the few foreigners in Addis Ababa, learning about the machines and methods that had transformed their nations. When he spoke to Ethiopia's powerful Orthodox priests, he did so with perfect mastery of ancient Ge'ez texts. When he met with provincial lords, he knew their family histories better than they did. His rise through the ranks was meteoric. Governor of Harar at 13. De facto foreign minister by 24. Each step carefully calculated, each alliance meticulously maintained. But it was his marriage to Menan Asfaw that proved his masterstroke. Beautiful, brilliant, and from a powerful, noble family, she shared his vision of an Ethiopia that could embrace progress without losing its soul. Together, they would work to transform their ancient nation, one careful step at a time. The culmination came in November 1930, when Tafari took the throne name Haile Selassie, Power of the Trinity. The coronation melded ancient pageantry with modern ambition. Foreign diplomats watched in amazement as 50,000 soldiers paraded past their new emperor, some in traditional warrior garb, others in crisp new uniforms. Selassie's own outfit for the ceremony symbolized his vision, traditional royal robes, but with a modern military cape. A golden crown rested on his head, while at his side hung a European-style sword. But even as he celebrated his triumph, dark clouds were gathering. In Rome, another man had risen to power, one obsessed with avenging Italy's humiliation at Ethiopian hands decades before. Benito Mussolini had his own vision for Ethiopia's future, and it had no place for Haile Selassie's dreams of modernization. The time bought by Selassie's careful maneuvers was running out. The question was, could he modernize his nation fast enough to save it? The fascist shadow, Mussolini, and the memory of ADWA. In the marble halls of Rome's Palazzo Venezia, Mussolini paced before a massive map of East Africa, his fingers repeatedly tracing the borders of Ethiopia. The humiliation of ADWA still burned in Italy's collective memory. The 1896 battle where Ethiopian warriors had crushed a modern European army, sending survivors fleeing through mountain passes strewn with broken Italian weapons. For the new Caesar of Rome, this black mark on Italian pride was intolerable. After all, how could he promise his people a new Roman Empire while the ghosts of AWA still haunted them? The first probes came in 1930, testing Ethiopia's defenses at Walwal, a dusty outpost in the Ogaden Desert. Selassie's intelligence network brought him detailed reports of Italian troop movements in neighboring Eritrea and Somalia. The numbers were staggering: 685,000 soldiers, hundreds of tanks, over 350 aircraft. While Ethiopian scouts counted Italian artillery pieces, Selassie worked frantically to modernize his feudal army. He hired foreign military advisors, purchased whatever weapons neutral nations would sell him, and built an air force of 13 aircraft, though finding pilots proved so difficult that he briefly considered learning to fly himself. But Italy's true weapons weren't just military. Mussolini's agents spread gold through Ethiopian noble houses, seeking to turn Selassie's vassals against him. They photographed Ethiopia's traditional justice system and tribal customs, using them in propaganda campaigns to paint the nation as barbaric and ripe for civilizing under Italian rule. When these efforts met with international skepticism, Italian agents engineered border incidents and clashes that could be used as pretexts for invasion. By 1935, the shadow looming over Ethiopia had become impossible to ignore. In the mountain capital of Addis Ababa, Selassie worked through the nights, sending desperate appeals to the League of Nations while organizing his defenses. His modernization program had made remarkable progress. Ethiopia now had a constitution, a national bank, and even a few paved roads. But he knew it wasn't enough. Not against what was coming. In September, his spies reported Italian troops singing a new marching song, "We will give you another ADWA." As autumn approached, the emperor gathered his generals in the Great Hall of Jubilee Palace. The maps spread before them told a grim story. Italy had built new roads and railways straight to Ethiopia's borders. Their spies reported massive stockpiles of chemical weapons. Against this, Ethiopia could muster 500,000 men, but barely a quarter had modern rifles. Most would fight with spears and swords that would have been familiar to their grandfathers. Looking at his commanders' faces, Selassie could see they all understood. They were about to fight a 20th century war with a medieval army. The question was no longer if Mussolini would strike, but when. As October dawned, Ethiopian border posts reported an eerie silence falling over the normally noisy Italian camps. In Rome, Mussolini gathered his fascist Grand Council for a late-night meeting. The time for shadows was over. The next act would begin with thunder. The dawn of Mussolini's revenge, the 1935 bombing of AWA. Dawn broke over the Ethiopian highlands on October 3, 1935, with an unfamiliar sound, the distant drone of aircraft engines. Without a formal declaration of war, Mussolini's air force struck first, their bombs shattering the morning calm of ADWA. The symbolism was unmistakable. Italy's campaign of revenge had begun at the very site of their greatest humiliation. As reports flooded into Addis Ababa, Selassie knew the moment he had dreaded for years had finally arrived. The emperor's response shocked both allies and enemies. He took personal command of the northern front, establishing his headquarters at Dessie. Foreign journalists watched in amazement as the slight, dignified monarch transformed into a wartime commander, working through nights with maps and battle plans, then mounting his white charger at dawn to inspect troops. His presence electrified the Ethiopian resistance, with thousands of warriors streaming into his camp daily, bearing whatever weapons they could muster, from modern rifles to their fathers' spears. But Italian technological superiority soon made itself felt in horrifying ways. When Ethiopian forces scored early successes against Italian troops, Mussolini authorized the unthinkable, the use of chemical weapons. Mustard gas, dropped from aircraft and sprayed from specialized tanks, turned battlefield victories into nightmares. Selassie's soldiers, who had fearlessly charged Italian machine guns, found themselves helpless against an invisible killer that burned their eyes, blistered their skin, and turned their lungs to fire. The northern campaign culminated in the Battle of Meichu in March 1936. For 2 days, Ethiopian forces under Selassie's direct command held against Italian tanks and artillery. The emperor's own imperial guard, the only Ethiopian unit fully equipped with modern weapons, fought with desperate courage, beating back repeated Italian assaults. But when the wind shifted and Italian aircraft began dropping chemical weapons, even the guard's discipline crumbled. Selassie himself had to be practically forced from the field by his commanders, who reminded him that his capture would mean the end of all resistance. Retreating south through mountain passes, the emperor was forced to confront an agonizing truth. His army could fight tanks. It could fight aircraft. It could even fight both at once. But it could not fight an enemy willing to use weapons that turned the very air into poison. As reports arrived of Italian forces advancing on Addis Ababa, Selassie faced the most difficult decision of his life. He could stay and likely die in a last stand, or he could leave, preserving his government in exile and hoping to rally international support against Italy's chemical warfare. What happened next would be debated for decades. After ensuring his family's escape, Selassie walked alone in the gardens of Jubilee Palace. At midnight, he made his choice. Ethiopia would need a voice to cry out against these atrocities. It would need a leader to rally resistance. Most of all, it would need someone to ensure that justice would eventually come. Boarding a train under cover of darkness, East Africa's last independent monarch began a journey into exile, not knowing if he would ever see his homeland again. Exiled Emperor in Bath, a fight for justice. The English city of Bath had seen its share of displaced royalty over the centuries, but none quite like the small, dignified man who took up residence at Fairfield House in 1936. Local residents quickly grew accustomed to the sight of the exiled emperor walking through the Victorian gardens, dictating letters to governments that had abandoned his country to fascism. The man who had once commanded armies now fought with telegrams and newspaper interviews, his only weapons the truth about what was happening in his occupied homeland. Living on rapidly dwindling funds, Selassie transformed his modest villa into a command center for Ethiopian resistance. His network of supporters smuggled reports out of Ethiopia detailing Italian atrocities. Each account was carefully documented, translated, and sent to the world's press. When Italian propagandists claimed they were civilizing Ethiopia, Selassie countered with proof of churches bombed, civilians gassed, and ancient manuscripts burned. His most powerful weapon was his own dignity. The sight of an emperor living in near poverty while continuing to fight for his people moved even the most cynical journalists. The British government's treatment of Selassie bordered on cruelty. While publicly expressing sympathy, they privately worked to silence him, fearing his presence would complicate their attempts to appease Mussolini. British officials tried to prevent him from broadcasting to Ethiopia. They intercepted his mail. They even suggested he should accept reality and renounce his throne. Instead, Selassie turned their own media against them. His BBC interviews reached across Africa, inspiring anti-colonial movements from Kenya to Jamaica. Each time Italy claimed Ethiopia was pacified, Selassie would produce fresh evidence of resistance fighters harassing Italian garrisons. But the emperor's greatest moment came in June 1936, when he traveled to Geneva to address the League of Nations. Speaking in his native Amharic, he delivered one of the most powerful speeches of the 20th century. "God and history will remember your judgment," he told the assembled diplomats. His warning that international law was becoming meaningless drew uncomfortable shuffles from representatives whose nations would soon face Nazi aggression. When Italy's delegates tried to drown him out with jeers, the contrast between their behavior and his composure only strengthened his message. As war clouds gathered over Europe in 1939, Selassie's patience finally began showing signs of paying off. British military planners, now desperate for allies against Italy, rediscovered their interest in Ethiopian resistance. As Mussolini moved closer to Hitler, the emperor began detailed planning sessions with British intelligence. His network of supporters had maintained contact with guerrilla forces in Ethiopia's mountains, where Italian control had never been complete. The moment to strike back was approaching. In the summer of 1940, Selassie looked out over his English garden one last time. 5 years of exile had turned his beard grey, but had hardened rather than broken his resolve. Mussolini had joined Hitler's war against Britain, and now the empire that had abandoned Ethiopia needed its help. As he boarded the plane that would take him to Sudan to begin the liberation campaign, Selassie permitted himself a rare smile. The wheel of fate had turned full circle. Now it was Italy's turn to face invasion. The lion roars back, Ethiopia's liberation campaign. From a dusty command post in Sudan, January 1941, Haile Selassie studied maps with British officers as Operation Canvas took shape. Ethiopian patriots had been fighting a guerrilla war for years. Now they would form the backbone of a full-scale liberation campaign. The emperor's presence electrified these preparations. Veterans of the 1935 resistance emerged from hiding. Young men who had been children during the invasion came forward to fight. Even British officials who had once shunned him now found themselves deferring to his intimate knowledge of Ethiopia's terrain. The campaign began with Selassie performing what seemed like a miracle. He crossed the border with just 800 Ethiopian exiles and a few British officers. It was a gamble that depended entirely on his reputation. Moving through Italian-held territory, he sent out messages announcing his return. The response exceeded even his hopes. Whole Italian-trained native units deserted to join him. Village militias that had been fighting independently now coordinated their attacks. The emperor's small force swelled into an army as it advanced, with patriots emerging from every valley and hillside to join the liberation. The Italians had spent 5 years and millions of lire trying to convince Ethiopians that their emperor had abandoned them. Now, watching him lead his growing army through mountain passes on his white horse, those efforts crumbled to dust. Selassie's advance became a triumphal procession. Villages that had hidden resistance fighters for years now openly celebrated. Priests brought out church treasures hidden from Italian looters. Each victory brought more recruits, and each recruit brought intelligence about Italian positions. On May 5, 1941, exactly 5 years after the Italians had forced him into exile, Selassie rode through the gates of Addis Ababa. The scene was electric. Thousands of residents poured into the streets, many holding Ethiopian flags they had kept hidden through 5 years of occupation. Italian troops, demoralized by Mussolini's defeats in North Africa and now facing a population in open revolt, surrendered in droves. The emperor's first act was to raise the Ethiopian flag over his reclaimed capital, declaring, "Today is the day on which we defeated our enemy. We shall see that our enemies are disarmed and sent out the same way they came." The reality of what Selassie had accomplished slowly dawned on the world. He was the first exiled monarch to reclaim his throne from a fascist power. He had transformed a feudal army into a modern resistance force. Most remarkably, he had done it all without compromising his dignity or principles. When his forces captured the Italian commanders who had ordered chemical attacks on Ethiopian civilians, he shocked everyone by refusing demands for execution. Instead, he had them deported, a gesture of magnanimity that embarrassed his former enemies and impressed his new allies. In Rome, the news of Ethiopia's liberation struck Mussolini like a physical blow. The easy victory that was supposed to restore Roman glory had become a humiliating defeat. The barbarian emperor had outmaneuvered him at every turn. By 1943, as Allied bombs fell on Italian cities, the Duce could no longer hide from the truth. His Ethiopian adventure had not only failed to create a new Roman Empire, it had helped destroy what remained of the old Italian one. The empire that had set out to conquer the Lion of Judah had instead only succeeded in proving his strength. Legacy of resistance: Selassie's impact on African independence. The significance of Selassie's victory reverberated far beyond Ethiopia's borders. Throughout colonized Africa, the story spread like wildfire. An African monarch had stood against European imperialism and won. In the streets of Accra, in the townships of South Africa, in the cafes of Dakar, people whispered about the Ethiopian emperor who had forced a European power to taste defeat. When Ghana became independent in 1957, its new flag bore Ethiopia's colors. When African leaders gathered to form the Organization of African Unity in 1963, they chose Addis Ababa as their headquarters, a tribute to the nation that had never fully lost its independence. But Selassie's later years proved that even legends face the tide of history. The emperor who had modernized Ethiopia found himself increasingly viewed as a relic by the 1960s. Young Ethiopians, inspired by his own reforms and education programs, began demanding faster change. The man who had embraced progress in the 1920s seemed to resist it in the 1970s. When famine struck in 1973, his attempts to hide it from the world damaged his reputation for honesty. The military coup that finally deposed him in 1974 ended not just his reign, but 3,000 years of Ethiopian imperial tradition. Yet even in death, Selassie's impact continued to grow in unexpected ways. The Rastafari movement, which had viewed him as a messianic figure since his coronation, spread Ethiopian culture and symbols worldwide through reggae music. His speeches about collective security and international law found new relevance in debates about global governance. Historians began to recognize that his resistance to fascism had been not just brave, but prescient. His warnings about international law and collective security had predicted the very issues that would shape the post-war world. Perhaps Selassie's most enduring legacy was proving that resistance to tyranny, even when it seems hopeless, is never futile. His 5 years in exile, maintaining dignity and purpose while working tirelessly for his people's liberation, set a template for leaders from Charles de Gaulle to the Dalai Lama. In the end, the emperor who traced his lineage to Solomon had added his own chapter to the ancient wisdom. Empires rise and fall, but the power of principled resistance endures. As modern Ethiopia continues to wrestle with its imperial past, one fact remains undisputed: for a crucial moment in history, when fascism seemed unstoppable and resistance appeared futile, an African emperor showed the world that determination and patience could defeat even the most powerful war machine. In doing so, he changed not just Ethiopia, but the very nature of resistance to tyranny. The last word belongs to Selassie himself. Years after his triumph, when asked about the secret of his victory, he replied with characteristic understatement, "We Ethiopians have a saying, the tears of today become the strength of tomorrow." I simply had faith that tomorrow would come,